Hi, everyone. My name is Dominik Dabrowski. I'm an occupational and environmental medicine resident over at Health Partners. My colleagues and I put together a poster for NORA. It's called Biomonitoring of Minnesota Firefighters Exposed to a Prolonged Metal Recycling Yard Fire. To give some context, in February of 2020, about an hour north of the cities in Becker, Minnesota, a fire erupted at Northern Metalworks and raged for about 4 days. We were approached by the firefighting chiefs because they were concerned about heavy metal and polyaromatic hydrocarbon exposures. They wanted us to biomonitor them, and this was after the fire had begun. And so we did post-exposure biomonitoring. And so what the exposures of concern were at the metal yard were cars, refrigerators, metals, glass, foam, and insulation. We broke down 109 different samples for our population by age, gender, fire department, years in service, time of fire, and duties performed. Here were the metals that were measured, the majority of which had blood serum as well as urine levels, which was a good fail-safe. We also measured their CBC and BMP, which are medical standards for most patients. We also searched for 6 different PAH metabolites, and then letters for each firefighter with results and interpretations were sent out. For arsenic, there was reflex fractionation, which simply means that it is broken down into organic, inorganic, and methylated arsenic. For polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the bulk of the work was done by Minnesota Department of Health at their Public Health Laboratory Division and Environmental Laboratory section. Here you can see why the name is multiple aromatic hydrocarbons, which is why these substances tend to have strong binding, but also why they have detrimental effects on the human body. Moving forward, only 99 urine samples out of 109 were sufficient because we needed 24-hour urine samples. If there were only spot urines or not incomplete 24 hours, we could not use them. And 41 of the samples were tested for polyaromatic hydrocarbons. For age of our demographic, it was relatively well distributed between ages 20 to 50 plus. However, the mean age was 40. This is fairly representative of the gender breakdown of firefighters across the US. That value happens to be closer to 90 versus 10%. However, this was pretty close and therefore informative. We suppressed the fire with some of our firefighters, and driver engineers were made up another high percentage of those that were doing the work on the fire, with a minority in command. This is relevant because command tends to be a little bit more removed, less directly exposed to the fire. So that's why we were interested in that. The majority of our firefighters were relatively well experienced, having more than 3 years of work with firefighters. And then the median amount of time spent on this particular fire by each firefighter was about 16 and a half hours, with 6 days post-exposure collection of the samples. Here, I would just like to point out the different fire departments from different parts of central Minnesota that fought the fire. And here is where Becker is on a map. The particular exposures of interest that we found, where more than 2 or so samples were above the reference range maximum, included chromium, which is present in alloys, electrical battery, plating, and pigments, manganese, which was present in things like alloys, chemical catalysts, electrical batteries, and fertilizers. For selenium, there was a very high number relative to other exposures. That is present in industries such as agriculture, chemical catalysts, but can also be present as a dietary supplement. So while we certainly couldn't tease that out in this sample, it's something to think about. Zinc could also be a dietary supplement, which is present in 2 samples, but it could also be from coatings, galvanizing, and paint. Here we have arsenic, which was collected spot urine, 24-hour urine, and then a ratio was collected. And here's what the fractionation looked like. Luckily, the majority of elevated arsenic species levels tended to be organic, which is the non-poisonous variety. And here we have, with their different levels of detection, 6 different PAH metabolites, which was also a significant exposure in our sample. So what can we take away from this particular study? Well, the results were de facto a cross-sectional study because while we intended to have follow-ups, unfortunately, none of the firefighters were interested in doing so. So we simply had a one-time sample. So recurrent ongoing exposures are a curiosity. Of course, inhalation was the primary source of exposure. However, skin absorption and ingestion were also considered. These poisons tend to have chronic damage, whether it is respiratory illness, cognitive dysfunction, or even carcinogenesis. It can take a very long time. So we were not very surprised that there weren't many acute symptoms, and we still recommend long-term ongoing monitoring for these patients. Community-based participatory research is something generally done for either ethnic groups or community groups or some other group. However, occupational CBPR is certainly something that's worth considering these are the people fighting fires on the front line. This study, unfortunately, was set up relatively quickly. We did not have baseline pre-exposure or post-exposure. The fire was already raging when it started. The short half-lives of metals meant that blood and urine levels may not be representative of true exposure, and complex analysis was lacking. It's something that we would like to do more of, particularly of modeling. So in conclusion, this is a cross-sectional pilot study of post-exposure biomonitoring firefighters, which is something that's relatively rarely done. We believe that these toxins should be followed over time because they could cause more damage. Further analysis recommended, and we also recommend specifically a cohort study of biomonitoring as needed to further understand some of these exposures, which do happen commonly throughout the firefighting community. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening to our presentation.